Chapter 9. Strengthened Alliance. I do not wish to go, Destin arguing, shaking his head as he looked between his sister and brother. He could not believe what he was hearing, that they had sold him off to the highest bidder, and now he was expected to leave everything he knew. He had always done as they had asked him. He had gone to be a ward and trained hard under the tutorage of the Karstarks. He had never questioned anything that they had asked of him. I know this is a lot to ask, Arthur said, shaking his head. He honestly didn't want to agree to such a match for his younger brother, but there would be no better offer for Destin. Destin was a second son, unlikely now to inherit anything since Arthur had two sons of his own now that secured the succession of House Tremaine and Airedale. A lot to ask. You're asking me to give up everything, Destin snapped, shaking his head and turning away from Arthur. He looked to Senora, hoping that she would argue in his favor, only to see the look on her face. He looked away quickly, unable to believe that they would send him south, that he would be sent away from the north instead of allowing him to serve the family like he had always wanted to. It was bad enough that he'd been forced to watch from the sidelines as the war raged on and he was kept away from the Fae, fighting hidden away like a child while his sister and brother claimed victories. If there was another way, then we would take it, Destin. But there is not, and we need to keep the peace with Stannis, Senora told him calmly. She knew that there was no way around such a match, and they had to make sacrifices, especially with what they knew about Jon Dotto. They needed to be able to offer Stannis something that wouldn't seem like all. Rickon was out of the question for that reason that he was a Stark. I would not ask this of you if there was another way. You shall be Shirian's prince consort, the father of her children, Senora explained, stepping closer to Destin. There were worse fates that could befall a younger brother, and she knew that nothing would happen to Destin while he was in such a position of power. No better than Lenor Velaryon, Destin scoffed with a shake of his head. You recalled how ill-fated Lenor had been when he'd married the Princess Rhaenyra and how they had wished that the Velaryon boys were not his. Perhaps he too would die so that Shireen could marry a man that she found to be a better match. The only bonus was that all of Shirian's uncles were dead by this point. What do you make of the marriage as your own? Shireen is a sweet girl. I think you'll find you have a lot in common with her, Senora said, trying to reason with Destin, who looked far from impressed with the fact that he was going to have to do this. The three siblings were silent, knowing that this could very well be the last time that they were all together. Senora and Arthur would bond to the north while Destin was to be sent south for the rest of his life. Stannis expects you to be in King's Landing within 3 months, Senora said, knowing that it gave him time to sort everything out and prepare himself for the trip. His entire life was about to be upended. He would likely never step foot back into the north if everything went to plan, but there was no telling what the future would hold. Destin nodded his head. He couldn't bring himself to look at Senora, nor Arthur, doubting that he would ever forgive them for agreeing to such a match without even consulting him. The door to the chamber opened, and Senora turned to see Ayanna stepping into the room. Her lady looked uncomfortable about interrupting the conversation, but she would not have come if it was not important. My apologizes, Your Grace, but an issue has arisen that needs your urgent attention in the Grand Hall, Ayanna said awkwardly. She had come right away when the guests had arrived, before even King Robb had sent her. Senora furrowed her brow. She could not imagine what would make Ayanna so nervous that she had come here to speak with her at such a time. But the look on her longest-serving lady told her that it wasn't something that could be ignored. Senora made her way out of the room, knowing that whatever was going on could only be bad news. Entering the great hall, Senora paused at the sight of several Ironborn that had gathered in the room, her eyes sweeping across the gathering to land on Robb and Yara, who were in the center of the great hall, conversing. The room seemed quiet as she made her way to the center. She ignored the looks from some of the Ironborn and the Northern Lords as she made her approach to find out what was going on. Robb eyed Senora as she came to stop by his side. He nodded his head gravely at her as he tried to wrap his head around what he had just been told. The Iron Islands have descended into civil war, Robb murmured, shaking his head, knowing that this was the last thing that they needed right now, especially having heard from Walt Yara that Euron planned to ally himself with Daenerys Targaryen. The idea that Euron would provide the Dragon Queen with boats to come to Westeros and overthrow everything that they had worked so hard to achieve when they had marched south to deal with the Lannisters. Senora took a deep breath. She wished that she could have seen this coming. But the look on Yara's face told her that the grim news was only going to get worse. My uncle has murdered my father, claimed the Salt Throne, and has announced his intention of allying with Daenerys Targaryen, Yara stated bluntly. She saw no reason to beat around the bush, and she knew what she had come here to do. It was not going to be easy, and she knew that the moment that Euron found out what she had done, then he would come after her to get rid of the only opposition that he had. He has married Arlenna Lannister, Yara admitted, knowing that Arlenna was wanted in the north for her actions during the war and the murder of her husband, Roland Tremaine. The room was silent at the news that Arlenna had finally resurfaced after all those months. King's Landing had been searched in the days after the siege had taken place, but there had been no sign of her. Rhaenyra's face betrayed nothing of how she felt at the news that her mother had finally shown back up, nor the fact that she had remarried to a man that planned to ally himself with Daenerys Targaryen. Inside, she was furious. She wanted to strangle her mother, and she wanted her to pay for the pain that she had put their family through with her selfish actions. "Why are you here? To ask for our help? To swear loyalty?" Robb asked, trying to understand what was happening. He didn't know why Yara had come here to them when the Ironborn tended to keep their issues between themselves. It didn't make sense that she would come to them, that she would willingly give them the information that she was giving without expecting something in return. Yara scoffed. She had thought about this long and hard, and the last thing that she wanted to do was give the Starks an ego boost, but she had nowhere else that she could turn right now. "I think we both realize how bad it would be if Euron brought the Dragon Queen to our shores. My uncle is a madman that will watch the world burn if he gets his way," Yara said. With a shake of her head, there was no winning if Euron was not stopped, and she could not do that on her own without help. It wasn't her strongest point, and she knew that she would have to concede some of her power to get the Starks to help her, but it would be worth it if it allowed her to gain back her inheritance and bring her father's killer to justice. "I shall bend the knee to the north, swear my allegiance in return for your support in reclaiming my home and bringing my uncle to justice for what he has done. I shall give the North and her realms a naval fleet that the rest of Westeros will envy," Yara vowed, knowing that this was the only way that the Iron Islands could survive. They had spent the last few years rotting away and picking fights with the North that they could never win. Perhaps it was time to cast aside the isolation that they had enforced on themselves and then become a part of something bigger. "You'd bend the knee to me?" Robb asked, unsure that he had heard Yara right. He had never thought that he would see the day that he would be faced with another Greyjoy again. It had been hard when Theon had betrayed him, and he wasn't sure that he had forgiven the man that he had once called brother, not enough to believe a word from his sister. "I would bend the knee to her," Yara corrected, looking directly at Rhaenyra, a woman that she would bend the knee for after everything that she had seen.